Silas hadn't touched the ground in 6 years, believing the redwood canopy was his impenetrable fortress. But while adjusting a sensor, a glint of unnatural light betrayed the silence. A pair of binoculars was fixed on him from the neighboring tree. He wasn't hidden anymore, and the hunt had just begun. Silas Vance stopped breathing when he saw the glint of metal that didn't belong. He'd lived in the canopy for 6 years, and in that time he'd learned to recognize every reflection the forest could produce. Dewdrops on spider silk, the iridescent shimmer of beetle wings, the occasional lost mylar balloon tangled in the understory far below. But this was different. This was glass and steel, manufactured precision, catching the filtered morning light in a way that nature never did. He lowered the moisture sensor he'd been calibrating and squinted through the veil of mist that perpetually hung between the ancient redwoods. There, 70 feet away on a neighboring giant, mounted on a platform that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, was a man with binoculars pointed directly at him, not a birdwatcher. The posture was wrong, too rigid, too focused, and birdwatchers didn't wear matte black tactical gear. Silas felt his heart rate spike for the first time in months. Up here, 150 feet above the forest floor, his world had been predictable, controlled, safe. The wind came from the west in the mornings, shifted north by afternoon. The ravens visited at dawn. The moisture levels peaked between 2 and 4 a.m. Everything followed patterns he could measure and anticipate. Human beings did not follow patterns. Human beings brought chaos. The watcher didn't move, didn't try to hide now that he'd been spotted. Just kept those binoculars trained on Silas with the patience of someone who'd been doing this for a while. How long had they been watching? Days? Weeks? The thought made Silas's skin crawl beneath his weathered flannel shirt. He forced himself to turn away casually, as if he hadn't noticed anything unusual, and walked back across the suspension bridge to his main cabin. The structure swayed with his weight, a gentle pendulum motion he'd long since stopped noticing. His hands, however, were trembling slightly as he pushed through the heavy tarp that served as his door. Inside the cabin, Silas went immediately to the lockbox beneath his bunk. His fingers found the key on its cord around his neck and opened the reinforced case. The Glock 19 was still there, oiled and loaded, exactly as he'd left it 3 years ago when he'd decided he didn't need it anymore. Apparently he'd been wrong. He checked the magazine, 15 rounds, and chambered 1. The mechanical click was obscenely loud in the quiet of his home. Silas hadn't fired a gun since the incident that sent him fleeing to the trees. His hands remembered the weight, though. Remembered what it felt like to hold the power, to end things. Through the cabin's single window, a square of salvaged plexiglass, he could see the neighboring tree. The platform was visible, but the watcher had moved, or descended, or called for backup. Silas didn't know which option frightened him more. His mind raced through possibilities. Reporters had found him twice in the early years, scrambling up with cameras and questions about Viridian dynamics, about the testimony he'd given, about whether he regretted destroying his career to expose the company's illegal dumping. He'd scared them off easily enough, but this felt different, more professional, more dangerous. Silas had known they'd never forgive him for what he'd done. The lawsuit had cost Viridian $200 million in fines and shut down 3 of their research facilities. But that was 6 years ago. He'd assumed they'd moved on, written him off as a hermit too crazy and remote to be worth the trouble of revenge. Apparently not. He moved to the eastern window and scanned the network of cables and platforms that made up the spire. 5 main structures connected by steel lines and rope bridges, zip lines for quick transit. Emergency descents disguised as irrigation hoses. He'd built it all himself over the years, each addition carefully engineered to support his weight and withstand the savage winter storms that tore through the canopy. But he'd never designed it as a fortress, never thought he'd need to defend it. The radio crackled to life on the shelf, making him jump. It was set to the emergency frequency, meant for forest rangers or the rare hiker in distress. Static hissed for a moment, then a voice cut through, mechanical and emotionless. "Dr. Vance, we know you can hear this. We're not here for you. We're here for the package. Send down the boy, and we'll leave you alone." Silas stared at the radio. Boy? What boy? His confusion lasted exactly 3 seconds before he heard the sound. A small scraping noise coming from the storage pod attached to the cabin's western side. The pod where he kept his seed collection and rare epiphyte specimens. The pod that was supposed to be empty of anything living. Gun raised, Silas crossed the cabin in 4 long strides and yanked open the connecting hatch. The space beyond was dark and cramped, barely 5 feet by 5 feet, filled with plastic drawers and mesh containers. And huddled in the far corner, pressed against the curved wall like he was trying to disappear into it, was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, maybe 90 pounds soaking wet. His clothes were torn and filthy, his dark hair matted with tree sap and dirt, but it was his eyes that struck Silas, wide and terrified, yet also calculating. This kid had seen things no child should see. "Jesus Christ," Silas breathed, lowering the gun. "How long have you been in here?" The boy didn't answer, didn't make a sound, just clutched something to his chest. A hard shell case, the kind used for protecting electronics or documents. His arms bore fresh chemical burns, the skin red and blistered in distinct splash patterns. Silas's medical training kicked in automatically. "Those burns need treatment. When did—" The radio crackled again. "Dr. Vance, you have 30 minutes to comply. After that, we start ascending, and we won't be gentle about how we search." The boy's eyes widened further, and he shrank back, a small whimper escaping his throat. The first sound Silas had heard him make. Silas looked from the terrified child to the radio, then back again. He didn't know who this boy was, or what he was carrying, or why armed men were threatening to climb into his sanctuary to retrieve him. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't handing a scared kid over to people who sounded like they were reading from a corporate termination script. "All right," Silas said quietly, holstering the gun. "All right, kid. You're safe for now. But you need to tell me what's going on. Who are you? What's in that case?" The boy's mouth opened, then closed. He shook his head, not in refusal but in inability. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words that had no voice. Mute. The kid was mute. "Okay," Silas said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Can you write?" The boy nodded hesitantly. Silas grabbed a notebook and pencil from his field kit and handed them over. The boy took them with trembling hands and began to write, his movements jerky and unpracticed. When he turned the notebook around, Silas read 2 words that made his blood run cold. "Viridian killed them." Silas stared at those 3 words for a long moment, feeling the weight of 6 years of isolation crack and splinter around him. He'd thought he was done with Viridian Dynamics, thought he'd paid his debt by testifying, by sacrificing everything, his career, his marriage, his daughter's respect, to expose their crimes. But the past apparently wasn't finished with him. "Killed who?" he asked, though he already dreaded the answer. The boy's pencil moved again, faster this time, more urgent. "My family, my town, poison in the water. I have proof." He tapped the hard-shell case with one burned finger. Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, not the simple meditative purpose of cultivating orchids or calibrating sensors, but the burning, dangerous purpose that had driven him to blow the whistle in the first place. The kind that destroyed lives, but occasionally, if you were lucky, saved more than it cost. "What's your name?" Silas asked. The boy wrote, "Noah." "All right, Noah. Here's what we're going to do." Silas moved to the window and scanned the forest. The mist was beginning to burn off, revealing more of the understory below. He couldn't see anyone yet, but that didn't mean they weren't there. "Those men down there, how many did you see?" Noah held up both hands, fingers spread. 10, maybe more. "And they followed you here, tracked you?" Noah nodded and wrote, "Drone found me. I ran. Climbed, found you. Smart kid." He'd known that going up was safer than running horizontally. Most people couldn't function at 150 feet. The fear of falling was too primal, too overwhelming. But Noah had pushed through that fear, climbed into the one place where normal tactical advantages, vehicles, firearms, numbers, meant nothing. The radio crackled a third time. 25 minutes, Dr. Vance. We're running calibration on our ascension equipment now. When we come up, we'll be thorough. Silas grabbed the radio and keyed the transmit button. "This is private property. You're trespassing. I've contacted the Forest Service and they're sending rangers." A pause, then a laugh, dry and humorless. "Dr. Vance, we both know that's not true. The nearest ranger station is 40 miles away and you don't have cell service up there. You haven't contacted anyone. You're alone." "You've always been alone. That's why you came here." The voice was right, and they both knew it. Silas had chosen this location specifically because of its isolation. No roads within 3 miles, no cell towers, no witnesses. It had been his refuge. Now it was his prison. "Who's we?" Silas asked, stalling for time. "Who am I talking to?" "My name is Kalen Reed. I work in asset recovery for Viridian Dynamics. The boy has something that belongs to my employer. Company property. Stolen company property. I'm authorized to retrieve it by any means necessary. He's a child. He's a thief, and you're harboring him. That makes you an accessory." Kalen's voice remained eerily calm, almost bored. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away from this, Dr. Vance. You've already caused my company considerable trouble. Don't compound your mistakes." Silas looked at Noah, who was watching him with those huge, dark eyes. The kid was terrified, but he hadn't tried to run. Hadn't tried to abandon the case. Whatever was in there, he believed it was worth dying for. "What's on the drive?" Silas asked quietly. Noah's pencil flew. Everything. Dump sites, falsified reports, people who died, towns that don't exist anymore. All of it. Silas closed his eyes. This was bigger than he'd thought, not just evidence of corporate malfeasance, but documentation of a cover-up. The kind of information that could bring down executives, trigger federal investigations, maybe even criminal charges. The kind of information people would kill to protect. "How did you get it?" Silas asked. Noah wrote, "My dad worked security, copied files before they killed him, gave me the drive, told me to run, to find the man in the trees who wasn't afraid of Viridian." Silas felt something crack open in his chest. This boy had climbed 150 feet through a hostile forest, burned and traumatized and alone, because someone had told him there was a man up here who fought Viridian once and might do it again. The weight of that trust was almost unbearable. "I'm not that man anymore," Silas said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. Noah wrote 3 more words, "Please don't fall." And just like that, Silas was back in the courtroom 6 years ago, watching his attorney lay out the evidence, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. His wife had been there, sitting behind the Viridian lawyers, her face a mask of betrayal. His daughter had refused to come at all. The company's defense had been simple. Silas was a disgruntled employee, mentally unstable, fabricating evidence to justify his own failures. They'd destroyed him. Professionally, personally, completely, but the evidence had been real, and the jury had seen it. Viridian had paid their fine, restructured, and moved on, and Silas had fled here to a place where the only thing that could hurt him was gravity. Now, gravity was coming for him anyway, carried by men in tactical gear with asset recovery authorization. 20 minutes, Kalen's voice announced. "Ascension equipment is ready. I suggest you spend this time wisely, Dr. Vance. Say goodbye to your treehouse." Silas turned off the radio and looked at Noah. The boy met his gaze steadily, no longer asking, just waiting, trusting that the man in the trees would make the right choice. "All right," Silas said, and felt something shift in him, something dormant waking up. "We're not giving them anything, but we can't fight them head on. They've got numbers, weapons, and equipment. So we change the battlefield, make them play by our rules. Noah's eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. Silas moved to his equipment locker and started pulling out gear. Carabiners, Prusik knots, pulleys, rope, all the tools he'd used to build this place. I designed the spire to be a sanctuary. Time to turn it into a trap. He grabbed a coil of high-tensile cable and handed Noah a smaller coil. Can you tie a bowline knot? Noah nodded and demonstrated quickly, his small fingers nimble despite the burns. Good. Because in about 18 minutes, this forest is going to get very dangerous for anyone who doesn't know how to fly. Silas worked with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 6 years learning every inch of his vertical kingdom. Noah followed him across the suspension bridges, watching as Silas modified the systems that kept the spire stable. The first modification was simple but effective. Silas loosened the tension on 3 of the rope bridges, leaving them attached but reducing the load capacity to barely nothing. They looked stable, but anyone over 100 pounds would find them bowing dangerously, the ropes creaking with strain. They'll test them first, Noah wrote on his pad as they worked. Probably, Silas agreed, but they'll be in a hurry. They'll want to close the distance fast, not give us time to prepare. And in tactical gear with weapons? They're carrying at least 50 extra pounds each. That matters at this height. The second modification was more complex. Silas had installed a pressurized irrigation system years ago using gravity-fed water from collection barrels mounted at the highest points. It was meant to mist his epiphytes during dry months. Now he rerouted the lines to the main ascent routes, converting gentle mist into high-pressure jets. Won't kill anyone, he explained to Noah as he tightened the final valve. But at 150 feet you don't need to kill someone. You just need to make them let go. Noah watched him with something like admiration. The kid was learning quickly, Silas realized. Learning that in the canopy, the usual rules didn't apply. Size and strength mattered less than balance and nerve. The third modification was the most dangerous. Silas prepared several of his emergency descent lines, but reversed them. Instead of providing a controlled drop to the ground, he rigged them to snap under weight and send anyone using them swinging wildly through the branches. Not fatal, probably, but disorienting enough to take someone out of the fight. The key, Silas said as they worked, is to make them afraid. Men like this, they're trained for urban environments, buildings, streets, hostage situations. They're not trained for this. He gestured at the vast network of cables and platforms surrounding them. Up here, fear is the enemy. Once you're afraid, you freeze, you hesitate, you fall. Noah wrote, "You're not afraid." Silas paused, considering the question implicit in those words. I used to be. The first year up here, I couldn't sleep. Every gust of wind, every groan of the cables, I thought this was it. This was the moment everything came down. But you get used to it. You learn to trust the engineering. Trust yourself. Trust gravity? Silas laughed, a sound that surprised him. He hadn't laughed in months. No, never trust gravity. Gravity's the only honest thing in the world. It always does exactly what it's supposed to do. It's humans you can't trust. A sound cut through the forest then, a mechanical whirring, growing louder. Silas grabbed Noah and pulled him down behind the platform's railing. Through the gaps in the wood, they watched as a quadcopter drone rose from the mist below, its camera gimbal swiveling as it scanned the canopy. They're marking our position, Silas muttered, feeding coordinates to the ground team. The drone hovered about 30 feet away, close enough that Silas could see the Viridian logo stenciled on its body. A small speaker crackled to life. "Dr. Vance, this is your final warning. You have 5 minutes to send down the boy and the drive. After that, we are authorized to use lethal force if necessary." Noah pressed closer to Silas, his small body trembling. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out his emergency flare gun, a device meant for signaling rescue helicopters during medical emergencies. He'd never fired it before. He aimed carefully at the drone, compensating for the wind, and squeezed the trigger. The flare rocketed out with a whoosh and struck the drone dead center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the magnesium ignited, burning at 3,000 degrees. The drone's plastic housing melted instantly. The aircraft spun wildly, trailing smoke, and plummeted into the abyss below. "Well," Silas said into the silence that followed, "I guess that's that. No more warnings." Noah stared at him with wide eyes, then picked up his pad and wrote, "That was amazing." "That was stupid," Silas corrected. "Now they know we're not cooperating. They'll come up fast and angry." As if in answer, the main anchor cable, the thick steel line that supported the entire platform, vibrated beneath their feet. Not the normal vibration of wind or shifting weight, but the rhythmic pulse of something mechanical climbing it. Silas ran to the edge and looked down. Through the thinning mist, he could see them. 6 figures in black tactical gear, ascending the massive redwood trunk using powered ascenders, motorized devices that clamped onto the cable and pulled them upward at terrifying speed. They'd be here in less than 2 minutes. "Time to see if this works," Silas muttered. He grabbed Noah's hand and ran back across the bridge to the main cabin. Once inside, he sealed the hatch and moved to his control panel, a jury-rigged collection of switches and valves that controlled the entire spire's infrastructure. "Remember the plan," he said to Noah. "When I open the hatch, you run to the western platform. Don't stop, don't look back. There's a zip line there that'll take you to the old growth grove 1/2 mile east. If something happens to me, you keep going. Follow the creek downhill until you hit the logging road. Flag down a car, get to a ranger station, give them the drive." Noah shook his head violently and wrote, "I stay with you, kid. I stay." There was no time to argue. The vibration on the anchor cable was getting stronger, closer. Silas took a deep breath and flipped the first switch. The pressurized water system activated with a hiss. Through the cabin's window, he saw jets of water blast outward from hidden nozzles, catching 2 of the climbers square in the face. At 150 feet, the force wasn't enough to knock them off, but it was enough to blind them, to make them instinctively reach for their faces with one hand, and in that split second of distraction, their weight shifted. One of the climbers lost his grip. His ascender slipped, and he dropped 15 feet before his safety line caught him. He dangled there, spinning slowly, trying to get his feet back onto the trunk. 4 left climbing, 2 stalled. Silas flipped the second switch. The modified rope bridges went slack, their tension cables releasing with a snap. He watched through the window as the lead climber tested one with his foot. It held for a moment, then bowed deeply. The man stepped back, said something into his radio, and changed course to a different approach. Smart. They were adapting. The third switch triggered the emergency descents. 3 climbers, trying to use what looked like safe routes, suddenly found themselves attached to lines that snapped and swung. One smashed into the trunk hard enough that Silas saw him go limp in his harness. 2 others were sent spinning through the branches, shouting into their radios, but 3 were still coming, and they'd learned from the mistakes of the others. They were moving more carefully now, testing every handhold, avoiding the obvious paths. These weren't amateurs. These were professionals who'd dealt with hostile environments before. Silas watched Kalen Reed lead the final ascent. Even through binoculars, the man's face was calm, focused. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent time in his life climbing, not recreationally, but operationally. Someone who'd rappelled into buildings, scaled walls, breached from above. "He's good," Silas muttered. Noah peered out the window and wrote, "He's the one who killed my dad." Silas looked at the boy, then back at the ascending figure. Personal now. This wasn't just about corporate asset recovery. This was about silencing witnesses. Kalen's voice came through on the emergency radio, which Silas had left on. "Clever tricks, Dr. Vance. Very clever. But you're running out of surprises, and we're running out of patience. When I get up there, and I will get up there, this ends badly for you. Last chance. Send down the boy." Silas picked up the radio. "Come up if you can. But remember, I've been living at 150 feet for 6 years. You've been climbing for 20 minutes. Let's see who's more comfortable with gravity." He clicked off before Kalen could respond and turned to Noah. "We're going higher. Crown level. It's exposed, but it's our best defensive position." Noah hesitated, then wrote, "What about your home?" Silas looked around the cabin, at the bunk where he'd slept through 6 winters, at the workbench where he'd catalogued hundreds of species, at the window where he'd watched countless sunrises. This place had saved him after Viridian destroyed his life. It had given him purpose, solitude, peace. But it was just a place. Just wood and steel and cable. And the kid standing beside him, scared but trusting, was a life that mattered more than any sanctuary. "Home's not a place," Silas said. "It's a choice, and I'm choosing you. Now let's go." He grabbed his emergency pack, water, knife, flare gun, first aid kit, and slung it over his shoulder. Noah clutched the hard-shell case to his chest and followed Silas out onto the platform. The crown of the redwood loomed above them, another 50 feet of vertical climbing through increasingly narrow branches. Silas had only gone up there a handful of times. The wind was brutal, the exposure terrifying, but it was also the one place where attackers couldn't approach from multiple angles. There was only one way up. They climbed quickly, Silas leading and Noah following with the agility of someone who'd grown up scrambling through trees. Behind them, below them, Silas could hear the climbers getting closer. Radios crackling, equipment clanking, the sounds of men who thought they'd already won. 50 feet from the crown, Silas looked back and saw Kalen Reed pull himself onto the main platform. The man stood there for a moment, scanning the network of cables and structures with professional assessment. Then his eyes tracked upward and locked onto Silas. Even at this distance, Silas could see the man's expression. Not anger, not fear, just cold calculation. This was a problem to be solved. An obstacle to be removed. Kalen said something into his radio and pointed upward. The 2 remaining climbers with him began ascending toward the crown. Silas and Noah reached the summit as the sun broke fully through the morning mist. Up here, 200 feet above the forest floor, the world was different. The branches were thin, flexible, swaying with every breeze. There was no platform, no safety net, just bark and sky, and a drop that would kill you before you had time to scream. Noah looked down once, then quickly looked away, his face pale. "Don't think about the distance," Silas said. "Just focus on the next handhold, the next branch. That's all that matters." They positioned themselves in a fork where 3 massive limbs met, creating a natural defensive position. Silas tied them both off with safety lines. If they fell, at least they'd only drop 20 feet before the rope caught them. Then he pulled out his flare gun and reloaded it with his last flare. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is where we make our stand." Noah wrote with shaking hands, "I'm scared. Me too, kid, me too." The first climber appeared below them, pulling himself hand over hand up the trunk. He was younger than the others, maybe mid-20s, and moving with the reckless confidence of someone who didn't fully understand the danger. He made it within 30 feet before Silas fired the flare. The magnesium burst, caught the man full in the chest. He screamed and let go with one hand to beat at the burning chemical. His ascender slipped. He swung out wildly, slamming into a branch, then fell another 15 feet before his safety line went taut. He dangled there, dazed and burned, no longer a threat. 1 down, 2 to go. But Silas was out of flares. All he had left was gravity and desperation. Kalen appeared next, moving more carefully than his subordinate. He'd seen what happened and adjusted. He kept 3 points of contact at all times, testing each branch before committing his weight. When he was 40 feet below them, he stopped and called up. "Dr. Vance, you're cornered. You have no ammunition, no exit route, and no hope. Be reasonable. We can still end this peacefully." "Your definition of peaceful and mine are different," Silas called back. "I'm offering you your life. That's generous, considering you just assaulted 3 of my men. You came onto my property with weapons. You terrorized a child. You work for a company that poisons communities and murders whistleblowers. Forgive me if I don't trust your generosity." Kalen was silent for a moment. Then he began climbing again. faster now, angry. You want to die for this kid? You don't even know him. He's nothing to you, just another stranger's problem. And that was the thing that broke through Silas's carefully maintained isolation, the wall he'd built around himself after losing everything. Because Kaylen was right, Noah was a stranger, but he was also a scared kid who'd been abandoned by every adult who should have protected him, who'd climbed into the sky because someone told him there was a man up here who might give a damn. He's not nothing, Silas said, and neither am I. Not anymore. Kaylen reached the branch just below them, his face slick with sweat despite the cold air. Up close, Silas could see the man was genuinely terrified of the height, his knuckles white where they gripped the bark, but he was pushing through it, professional training overriding primal fear. Last chance, Kaylen said. The drive, now. No! Kaylen pulled a pistol from his hip holster and aimed it at Silas. Then you die, and then the boy dies, and the evidence disappears. Viridian continues. Nothing changes. All this, he gestured at the forest around them, for nothing. Silas looked at the gun, then at Noah, then back at Kaylen. The man was right about one thing. Up here, with nowhere to run, Silas couldn't win through force, couldn't outshoot him, couldn't outfight him, but he could outthink him. You're afraid of heights, Silas said conversationally. Kaylen's jaw tightened. Irrelevant. No, it's very relevant, because I'm not. Silas took a casual step out onto a branch that was barely 4 inches thick. It bowed slightly under his weight, swaying in the breeze. I've lived up here for 6 years. I know these trees. I know which branches are load-bearing and which ones just look like it. He took another step, and the branch dipped alarmingly. Kaylen's eyes widened. See, that's the difference between us, Silas continued. You're up here because you have to be. I'm up here because I chose it, and that makes all the difference. Get back here, Kaylen ordered. Now! Or what? You'll shoot me? If I fall, the drive falls with me, 200 feet straight down into the creek. You'll never recover it. Is that what you want to tell your bosses, that you had the evidence in your hands and threw it away? Kaylen's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Couldn't fire. Because Silas was right. Killing him solved nothing. What do you want? Kaylen asked through gritted teeth. Safe passage, me and the kid. We walk away. The evidence goes to the FBI. Viridian answers for what they've done. That's not going to happen. Then we stay up here. And you have a choice. Climb back down and report your failure, or try to come get us and see which one of us is better at not falling. For a long moment, they stared at each other across 20 feet of empty air and 200 feet of fatal drop. The wind picked up, making the branches sway and groan. Somewhere below, one of the injured climbers was shouting into his radio, calling for instructions. Then Kaylen did something Silas didn't expect. He smiled. You're right, the man said. I am afraid of heights. Absolutely terrified. Have been my whole life. Do you know why I took this job anyway? Why I forced myself to climb up here even though every instinct I have is screaming at me to go back down? Why? Because I'm more afraid of failing than I am of falling. Kaylen holstered his pistol and began climbing toward them. Not carefully now, not professionally, just fast, reckless, driven by fear, transformed into aggression. He closed the distance in seconds, reaching for the branch where Silas stood. And that was when Silas triggered his final trap. Hidden in the fork above them, secured with a quick-release knot he'd tied while Noah wasn't looking, was a counterweight, not rope. Silas used high-tensile cable for his counterweights, the kind that could support hundreds of pounds without stretching. This particular counterweight was a cargo net filled with rocks he'd collected over years, meant to stabilize the whole platform network during storms. When he pulled the release cord, the entire system shifted. The counterweight dropped 30 feet in an instant, pulling tight on the cable network. The sudden tension acted like a catapult on every connected branch. The limb Kaylen was reaching for whipped upward with violent force, moving faster than he could react. His hand closed on empty air. His feet left the bark. For a moment he seemed to hover there, suspended in defiance of gravity's honest law. Then he fell. Not straight down. That would have been quick. Instead, he caught a loose cable, one of the backup lines Silas had deliberately left unsecured. It arrested his fall with a bone-jarring jolt, leaving him dangling 40 feet below, spinning slowly in the wind. "Help!" Kalen gasped. "Help me!" Silas looked down at the man who'd come to kill them, who'd chased a traumatized boy through the forest, who worked for a company that had destroyed lives, families, entire communities, and called it cost of doing business. Noah tugged on Silas's sleeve and wrote with shaking hands, "What do we do?" "Gravity always does exactly what it's supposed to do," Silas had said earlier. It was the only honest thing in the world. And looking down at Kalen Reed, watching him dangle above that terrible drop, Silas felt the weight of that honesty pressing down on him. He could pull the man up, could save him, could prove that he was better than them, better than the system that had crushed him, better than the revenge he'd dreamed about in his darkest moments up here alone. Or he could let go, could release the cable clamp and let gravity do its work, could eliminate a threat and send a message. Some actions have consequences that can't be bought off or lawyered away. "Please," Kalen whispered, I'm just doing my job." "Yeah," Silas said quietly. "That's the problem." He reached for the cable clamp, and Kalen's eyes widened in understanding. "Wait!" "The forest cleans its own floor," Silas said, and released the clamp. The cable snaked free with a metallic whisper. Kalen dropped silently, no scream, just a brief, rushing sound of air and fabric. Then nothing. Noah buried his face against Silas's shoulder, and Silas held him there, not looking down, not wanting to see. The weight of what he'd done settled over him like a physical thing, heavy and cold and permanent. He'd spent 6 years hiding from the consequences of his choices, running from the destruction of his old life, telling himself that up here, above the world, he could be free of moral complexity, but you could never outrun gravity, and you could never escape the weight of your own decisions. "We need to go," Silas said, his voice rough. "His team will have heard his fall. They'll be coming." "Erdee!" But when he looked down through the branches, he saw the remaining climbers retreating, descending rapidly, their movements panicked and disorganized. They'd seen their leader fall, seen what this place did to people who underestimated it. They were done. The silence that followed was profound. No radios, no equipment sounds, no voices calling threats or instructions, just wind and creaking branches and the distant cry of a raven announcing the day. Silas and Noah stayed in the crown for another hour, making sure the retreat was real. When Silas finally used his binoculars to scan the forest floor, he saw the black-clad figures moving away through the understory, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead. "It's over," he said to Noah. "For now." The boy looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes and wrote, "Will they come back?" "Yes," Silas said honestly. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but Viridian doesn't forgive, doesn't forget. And we have something they want to bury. Then what do we do?" Silas looked around at the spire, his home, his refuge, his fortress, the place he'd built to escape the world. He thought about staying here, trying to defend it against the next team they sent, and the team after that, fighting until gravity or bullets or time caught up with him. But that wasn't a life. That was just a slower kind of dying. "We go down," he said. "We take the fight to them. On the ground, in the courts, in the media. We use the evidence your father gave his life to collect. We finish what we both started." "You hate the ground, I do," Silas admitted. "I think of it as a graveyard, a place where everything I loved died. But maybe—" He paused, looking at Noah, this scared, brave kid who'd climbed into the sky to find hope. "Maybe it's also a place where things can grow again, if you're willing to plant them." Noah considered this for a long moment, then wrote, "Will you teach me about the plants, the ones you grow up here?" "Yeah," Silas said, feeling something warm and painful in his chest. "Yeah, kid, I can do that." They spent the rest of the day preparing for descent. Silas packed the essentials, his research notes, his seed collection, tools he couldn't replace. He left behind everything else, The furniture, the equipment, the structures he'd spent years building. It was just stuff, just weight. The hard part was what came next. Silas set a timer on the main generator, rigging it to overload in exactly 4 hours. The resulting surge would fry all the electrical systems and, more importantly, would ignite the fuel stores he kept for the backup power. The fire would spread through the wooden platforms, consuming his research, his records, everything that made the spire his home. He couldn't let Viridian have it. Couldn't let them study his work, learn his secrets, maybe even weaponize his botanical research the way they'd weaponized everything else they touched. Better to burn it all than let them profit from it. "Ready?" he asked Noah as they stood at the base of the long line. An emergency escape cable that stretched 3 miles down the valley to an old logging road. Silas had installed it years ago, but never used it. Never thought he'd need to. Noah looked back up at the canopy one last time, then nodded and wrote, "Ready." Silas strapped them both into a tandem harness connected to a brake mechanism. The system was simple. Gravity would pull them down the cable at increasing speed, and the brake would keep them from accelerating into a fatal velocity. In theory. He'd never actually tested it with 2 people. "Hold on tight," Silas said, "and whatever you do, don't look down." He released the brake, and they dropped into the void. The first 100 feet were terrifying. They fell faster than Silas had anticipated, the wind screaming in their ears, the brake mechanism shrieking against the cable. Noah's hands dug into Silas's arms hard enough to bruise. Then the brake caught properly, and their descent smoothed out. They were still moving fast, 20, maybe 30 miles per hour, but controlled now, sustainable. The canopy blurred past them, a wall of green and brown. The ground, which Silas hadn't stood on in 6 years, rushed up to meet them. Behind them, above them, Silas heard the distant whump of the generator exploding. A column of smoke rose into the morning sky as the spire began to burn. His home, his sanctuary, everything he'd built to escape the world, gone in flames. And somehow Silas felt lighter than he had in years. They hit the ground hard, rolling into the damp earth of the logging road. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Silas stood up on shaking legs and felt the solid, heavy ground beneath his feet. It didn't sway, didn't flex, didn't threaten to drop him into the abyss. It was stable, reliable, real. "How are you doing?" he asked Noah. The boy stood up slowly, brushed dirt from his clothes, and looked around at the world he'd fled days ago. His lips moved, forming words without sound. Then, so quietly Silas almost missed it, he spoke. "Okay." One word, barely a whisper, but a word nonetheless. Silas knelt down in front of him. "Say that again." "Okay," Noah repeated, slightly louder. I'm okay." Tears streamed down the kid's face, but he was smiling. And Silas realized this was the first time he'd heard Noah speak. The first time the boy had felt safe enough to use his voice. "Yeah," Silas said, pulling him into a hug. "We're okay." They walked down the logging road together, heading toward civilization, toward federal agents and lawyers and media circus, toward the fight that would define what happened to Viridian and everyone they'd hurt. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be safe, and it might not even work. But for the first time in 6 years, Silas Vance felt like he was moving towards something instead of running away. And when Noah reached up and took his hand, trusting him to lead the way, Silas made a promise to himself. No more hiding in the trees. No more pretending the world below didn't exist. He'd come down from his sanctuary. Now he'd fight to make sure no one else had to flee to the sky just to survive. 3 months later, the courtroom was smaller than Silas remembered. More cramped. The air was stale and processed, nothing like the clean, cold wind of the canopy. He sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a suit that didn't fit right, feeling suffocated by the tie around his neck. But Noah sat beside him, dressed in his own uncomfortable suit, holding the hard-shell case containing the evidence that had survived everything. And on the defense side, The Viridian executives sat in their expensive tailored suits, looking confident. They didn't know what was coming. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rebecca Chen, who'd taken the case personally after reviewing the evidence, stood up and addressed the jury. She outlined the charges: 23 counts of environmental crimes, 14 counts of negligent homicide, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and witness intimidation. Then she played the first video from Noah's Drive. The footage showed a Viridian facility at night, trucks dumping barrels of chemical waste directly into a creek. The creek that fed the aquifer that supplied water to Noah's town. The waste that had killed his family and dozens of others. The defense attorneys objected. The judge overruled them. Chen played another video and another, 40 minutes of documentation, proof that couldn't be denied or explained away, evidence that a little boy had carried out of hell because someone told him there was still justice in the world. When it was done, the lead defense attorney stood up and tried to discredit the source. "Your Honor, this evidence was obtained illegally by an employee who violated his confidentiality agreement. It cannot be." "The employee you're referring to," Chen interrupted, "was murdered by your client's security team before he could testify. Would you like to address that?" Silence in the courtroom. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, the jury deliberated for 40 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The CEO got 18 years, the head of operations got 12. Asset recovery, or what was left of it after Kalen Reed's death, was dissolved. Viridian Dynamics declared bankruptcy 6 months later. Silas and Noah walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Silas just kept walking, one hand on Noah's shoulder, until they reached the park across the street. They sat on a bench beneath an oak tree, not as tall as a redwood, but alive and growing nonetheless. "What happens now?" Noah asked. His voice was getting stronger, more confident every day. "Now?" Silas looked up at the branches above them, feeling the pull of height, the temptation to climb. But he stayed seated, stayed grounded. "Now we figure out how to live down here, together, as a family." Noah looked at him with those serious, dark eyes. "Like, you'd adopt me. If you want, if you think you can put up with an old hermit who talks to plants and still flinches every time a car drives by." Noah smiled. A real smile, not the scared, uncertain thing it used to be. "I think I can manage that." They sat in silence for a while, watching people walk past, living their normal lives. Lives that didn't involve corporate conspiracies, or aerial fortresses, or 100-foot drops. Lives that were complicated in different ways, but no less real. Silas thought about the spire burning in the forest 3 months ago, about the years he'd spent hiding from the world, about how he'd convinced himself that height equaled safety, that isolation equaled peace. But gravity had found him anyway, had brought him a scared boy who needed help, had dragged him back down to earth and forced him to remember that some things were worth the risk of falling. "I miss it sometimes," Silas admitted. "The canopy, the quiet, the certainty of knowing exactly how far you had to fall." "We could visit," Noah suggested. "The forest, I mean. Not the spire, obviously. But we could go camping, climb trees. You could teach me about the plants." "Yeah," Silas said. "Yeah, we could do that." A raven landed on the bench beside them, cocking its head curiously. It looked at Silas with one bright eye, as if recognizing him from another life. Then it spread its wings and took off, soaring up into the sky. Silas watched it go and felt the familiar pull of height, the yearning to follow. But this time he also felt something else. The warmth of Noah's shoulder against his side, the solid ground beneath his feet, the knowledge that he wasn't alone anymore. He'd spent 6 years learning to fly. Now he was learning to land, and maybe, just maybe, that was the harder and more important skill. "Come on," Silas said, standing up. "Let's go home." "Where's home?" Noah asked. Silas took his hand and smiled. "Still figuring that out, but I know who it's with." They walked away from the courthouse together, leaving behind the trial and the testimony and the weight of justice finally served. Above them, the ravens circled once, then flew west toward the redwood forests, and somewhere in those ancient trees the canopy swayed in the wind, eternal and unconcerned with human drama. The forest had already forgotten the spire, already reclaimed the space where Silas had hidden from the world. But Silas Vance didn't need a fortress anymore. He'd found something better than isolation, something worth the terrible risk of trusting gravity again. He'd found family. He'd found purpose. He'd found the courage to live on the ground. And that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, click on the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage meet in ways you never imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us continue bringing you stories like these. Your support means everything to us.